My name is Bob Olson, and I'm an alcoholic. And by the grace of God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found a need or an excuse to take a drink today, nor have I found a need or an excuse to take a drink since May 28th of 1973. I am really getting old. I'm a member of the Happy Way group in Englewood, Colorado. I didn't name it. Sounds like a bunch of people on Thorazine. See, if it was my choice, I'd call it the Beaten Into a State of Reasonableness group, or the outright mental defectives, but they didn't ask me. It was there a long time before I got there. So, well, I'm impressed. I had a really good time this weekend. It was a lot of fun listening to Dan. Dan and I come down the same sponsorship line in different states. But there was a guy that was around that's Dan's grand sponsor, that was my sponsor for 32 years, and his name was Don P. Those of you who know, there's a guy who came to this conference for a while who was Don P's first sponsor, and his name is Gary B., and he's from Indianapolis. Anyway, it was fun to listen to Dan, and we have a lot of common friends and a lot of common experience. I got the biggest kick out of Agnes Ann. You'll notice sometimes that some of the best AA talks are given by Al-Anons. And listening to Liz. No one would question that for a moment. It just... I'm coming up on my 35th birthday in AA, and I'm still 20 years behind her. Gee whiz. Well, she gives me hope. You know, when you see someone who is that clear and has that much energy in this program for 55 years, oh my God, isn't that something? So, and tomorrow morning you're gonna hear from another member of my home group in Englewood, Colorado, and his name is Jack, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy him. I'm going to talk about recovery. I drank a fifth a day for almost 15 years. My liver was as big as a football when I quit drinking. I had a lot of difficult experiences when I was drinking in the military. I was a bill collector in Chicago. I was a 240-pound psychopath that used to kick in people's doors and beat them up against the wall until they figured out how they were going to pay. I'm not proud of that part of my life, but it was part of my life. I should hasten to say that I am so delighted to see Camille and Bob. And Camille and I were both members of the old Denver Young People's Group, which shows you how long ago that was. Not because Camille looks any older, but that was in the early 70s. And we had a group of people who really had an opportunity to change our whole direction because of an international convention that came to Denver in 1975. Anyway, I'm delighted to see both of you, as I always am. So, my family is alcoholic, and I come from, my dad died from alcoholism. The Olsons in Madison, Wisconsin, although there's a lot of them, I mean, they're like fleas on a dog up there. And people in my family have been dying from alcoholism ever since we got here from Norway. So, and interestingly enough, the incidence of alcoholism among Scandinavians up there is just as high or higher than the Irish and almost as high as the Indians. So, my family's been dying from alcoholism for generations. And I did not know, nor did I believe, that you could find recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous, even when I started coming here. I watched all those members of my family died, and I didn't think that my disposition was going to lend itself to anything else but an early death. I am amazed that I lived past 30. So, and when I was in the military, I was lucky that I didn't get killed. And when I was a bill collector in Chicago, I was lucky that I wasn't killed. And I had friends, we used to go collect money in the projects. And I had a good friend that worked for Universal CIT, which is another finance company, that walked into Cabrini Greens and knocked on somebody's door, and they put 5 rounds in his chest. And he died before he hit the ground. And I was collecting money in those places when the Black Panthers were active in Chicago, and they were sniping off the top of the projects. So, I mean, it was like being in combat part of the time, and it was just insane. I just drank way too much for way too long. And I can tell you some funny stories, and I don't want to. I just don't. You know what I want to talk with you about? I want to talk with you about recovery and what happened to me in Alcoholics Anonymous and the kinds of things that I've found from being active in a group that follows the recovery program. And I've been writing inventory. I've been going through the 12 steps once a year for 35 years. And there are no scars on me as a result. All right? So if you're ever curious about what would happen to you if you lent yourself to this process of recovery once a year, as long as you're sober, I'll tell you what happened to me. So anyway, I went to Alcoholics Anonymous starting in 1968. I didn't get it. Okay, I went in there and I would, I remember a guy that lived in the apartment building that I lived in, and a guy named Gino, and he and I used to get drunk all the time. And then sometimes we'd get a little maudlin when we were drunk, and we'd say maybe we ought to go turn ourselves into Alcoholics Anonymous. So we would always be about half ripped, and we would drive down to the AA clubhouse in Madison and go in there and let people stroke us. And, you know, people were the best intentioned of people. And they would come up and they would kind of pet us. And say, you're going to be just fine. You just keep coming back. And it was an outrageous lie. It wasn't going to be all right. I can't tell you how much worse it got. But I can tell you that the book says that the message that will interest alcoholics must have depth and weight. And keep coming back doesn't do it. Right? There's a line in the foreword to the first edition that says, to show others precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. It doesn't say to show others generally how we recovered. Okay? And see, if I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I remember when I used to want to hit people in AA meetings when I was still drinking. I'd walk in there and someone would look at me very sagely and say, if you don't drink, you won't get drunk. You know, other than screaming you have a clear grasp on the obvious, you know, there was an old guy and I couldn't hit him because he was too old. And he looked at me and he said, keep the plug in the jug. You know, for years I bordered on homicidal and had a reputation for being out of control, what the book describes as dangerously antisocial. And people would say things like that to me, and I knew it was just somebody trying to sound smart. And they were messing with, I knew I was dying from this thing. And I didn't know how to stop, and I didn't believe I could stop, and I knew that eventually I would succumb to this disease, and people would say those kinds of inane things to me in meetings, and I would just go ballistic. And if someone had come up to me and said, I can show you precisely how to recover, have you ever heard anyone say that in an AA meeting? Why not? Why not? The instructions are in the book. And I think that people think that they're going to sound magnanimous when they say, I can show you precisely how to recover. But if they have followed the directions, they can show you precisely how to recover. See, when I come in here, I know I'm done. You know, game's over for me. And if someone would have said, wait a minute, you don't have to do that. This works for everyone who tries it, everyone who gives it a really good try. This works. I think I would have had more hope than I had. And see, I went to AA meetings from 1968 to 1973, never drew a sober breath the whole time. In 1973, I had a wife and 2 sons, and my wife just got sick of the whole thing and bailed. Took the kids and went to Europe. Went to France, went to the French Riviera. God bless her. As far away from me as she could get. And I woke up on the floor of an empty house in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And my old sponsor was standing over me, looking at me, and he had brought a new guy to help him 12-step, because that's we used to go see people, you know. 12-stepping back then, you actually went out and went to somebody's house and did all that stuff. And so he brought this guy with him, and the guy looked like he had St. Vitus dance. He was jumping around me. I was on the floor, and he was going, oh my God, is he going to go into DTs? What are we going to do with him? Should we give him orange juice? What do you think we ought to do? He really looks sick. Maybe we ought to take him to the hospital. Oh my God, what do you think we ought to do next? See, if I would have had a gun, I would have shot the son of a bitch. There are a lot of people who are alive today because I wasn't armed in AA meetings. This guy was appropriately named Dick. They took me They took me to a halfway house for alcoholics called the Blandine House in Fond du Lac, and they put me down in front of a priest. It was a priest that ran the halfway house. He belonged to an order that was like a missionary order, and he was a guy that worked just with drunks. And they plopped me down in front of him, and they said, started asking me questions. He said, "Are you an alcoholic?" And I said, "Uh-huh, I sure am." And I'm not sure I'd ever said that before. And he said, "Are you done?" That's a really good question to ask a drunk. And I said, "I don't know. But if I'm not, I don't think I can survive." I had reached a point in my life where if I took another drink, my liver was sticking out of my side. And if I took another drink, I knew what would kill me. I didn't have any illusions about dying from this. And if I didn't take another drink, it was going to kill me. So you kind of reach a point where you got no hope left because you're just too messed up to make it either way. And he said, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "No." And I said it just to piss him off. I did. I was brought up a German Lutheran. And having a priest in front of me was not my idea of a good time. So, and I think the thing that I want to tell you about that is a really odd thing about drunks. And the odd thing is that we will keep fighting when there's no point. I mean, somebody can be standing there trying to save our life and we still want to fight. What's the point? I didn't get it. You know, I'm thinking this guy is a priest and I'm going to tell him where to bury the buckwheat, right? And he's going, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, then it looks like you're SOL." And I thought that was inappropriate for a priest. And I said, "What do you mean?" He was telling me what he meant. And he said, "Can you stop drinking?" And I said, "No, I can't." And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I'm absolutely certain." He said, "Well, I got some bad news for you, Bob, and that is that we can't stop you either. There aren't enough people in this room or in this city to stop you from taking another drink if you want one." And I thought, "Oh, all right, what am I doing here?" And he said, "So there better be a God, because if there isn't, game's over." And I understand that, okay? And I said, "I don't know what to do about that." And he said, "We're going to send you home, and I would try to pray for this God to come into your life and save it, basically." And I said, you know what's going to happen to me if they leave me there." And he said, "Yeah." And then they took me home. Now, I'd been in DTs before, and the idea of going through that again, that's a horrible experience. And they took me back to this house that I had been living in and left me. And then for the next 48 hours, I went through DTs and hallucinations and saw things that I have never seen before or since. And I flopped around on the floor like a fish out of water and saw terrible things. It's an old joke about it, but I saw ants that were like the size of this table coming out from underneath the refrigerator when I was coming down off of that. And I lived in a small house, and there were 3 cans of Raid in the basement steps. So I went in there and I emptied them all in the kitchen and damn near asphyxiated myself. And after 2 days, these guys came back to see if I was still breathing. And they took me to an AA meeting. And they put me back down in front of this priest, and he said, well, what do you think? And I said, I think I'm lucky to have survived that. And see, because I don't know if you know about, and a lot of drunks have gastritis. We irritate the hell out of our esophagus. And esophageal cancer has a real high incidence among alcoholics. So anyway, I had this thing where I felt like my chest was just going to seize up all the time. And for like 48 hours, I thought I was going to die every minute. And I just was waiting for the inevitable, and it didn't happen. So he said, what do you think about God? And I said, I don't know. Don't know. And he said, what would you like God to be? And I said, maybe like Father. My dad was a drunk and split when I was an infant, and when I saw him, the only time I ever saw him, he was really violent. And I mean, I got backhanded down 2 flights of stairs one day just for grins. And you got to be careful about that stuff, by the way, because it has a tendency to move forward in generations. And when I was a bill collector in Chicago, I was extremely violent. And then I started looking at this disease, and the whole idea that either alcoholism or violence would move forward in generations in my family is an abhorrent idea to me. And so I don't want any part of it. So he said, the priest told me that he thought God the Father was a great idea. Now, if you want to really know the truth, God is beyond our comprehension. So if we just have a nice idea, it works good, you know. But I've come to believe that if the whole business about omnipotent and omniscient and all the rest of that about God, having no beginning, no end, no edges, is true, then it's beyond my comprehension, and I don't muddy up my mind trying to figure out who God is before I believe in him. Okay? God works in my life. It just, I don't have to know what he looks like. I just know he works. And I don't know if he's a he. I do workshops and people go, let's call God her. You want to know something? Lending gender to God is absurd. God is a spirit, God is something, but I bet it doesn't have a gender. And so I don't care if God's a she, he, she, it, what works. That's all I care about. And today I understand that my job in life is to lead a life that's pleasing to God. Now, I know what that looks like, but I don't know what God looks like. And then maybe one day I'll find out, maybe I won't. I don't know. The book says that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we're like other people, or presently may be, which is a 1938 way of saying or ever will be, has to be smashed. Concede's an interesting word. If I have to fully concede to myself that I'm alcoholic, concede means to give grudgingly. Okay? That means I don't have to like it. I just have to do it. All right? So the evidence is overwhelming that I'm alcoholic. And I can sit there and argue with that, until the cows come home. But the real truth is that that's what I am. That's what I'm always going to be. And now my job is to live a spiritual life. It was funny because when I was listening earlier about living a spiritual life or dying an alcoholic death aren't always easy alternatives to face. Why not? Did you ever look at that? Are you crazy? If you go up to any sane, rational person on the street and said, I'm terribly sorry, but there are only two choices in your life. And one of them is to live a spiritual life, and the other one is to die an alcoholic death. Which one do you choose? They'll look at you like you just fell off a plane or something. You know what a drunk will say? Let me get back to you. Why do I know that? So, I did. I know I'm one. And when I go back, I go through the steps once a year. And when I go through the steps, I have to go back to the first step and start all over again with the premise that I may really not be an alcoholic. And that maybe for the last 34 years I've been doing this because I'm deluded. And then I have to relook at the idea, am I really an alcoholic? And is my life really unmanageable? Absolutely. A lot of people write about control. Do you know that there isn't any? Do you know that that's an illusion? Control's an illusion. So is personal power, incidentally. See? My idea is to have you shaking your head by the time you get out of here. All right? What I want to do is I want to talk to you about the experience that I've had in recovery and have you think about it. And you have a perfect choice to do anything you choose to do. But I'll tell you something about me. And that is that I absolutely refuse to be any crazier than I have to be. I don't want to. I don't want to die without the truth. I am tired of living in alcoholic insanity and frankly haven't for years. But there is always a piece of us that needs a little fixing. And how do you find the pieces? See, the only reason why I'd leave Centennial, Colorado, I had a nice 4-bedroom house. I've got 5 kids, and I've got 5 sons and 2 grandsons in a really successful business, which is God's really kind of weird sense of humor. I'm one of the largest providers of mental health treatment in the state of Colorado. People for years thought I was nuts. And today I direct the work of psychiatrists. And people go, how'd that happen? I live a life today that's more than I ever expected out of life. And it isn't one that I chased, it's one that happened. And so what I chose to do in Alcoholics Anonymous was to truly live a spiritual life, and it happened. And today, I'm financially secure. I've got this business that my oldest son is in right now, and he'll wind up with. I have the love of all my children and my grandchildren. I have the respect of my peers. I'm a contractor for the state of Colorado, for the Department of Corrections, and they just think I'm wonderful. They call me up and ask me about how do we do this and how do we do that and what would be a good decision. And how did that happen to me? Do you know, let me just say, I don't mean to be scattered, but if you want to build trust in other people, be consistent. That's what builds trust. If people can figure out what you're going to do before you do it, they'll trust you. Right? So this priest was asking me what I thought about God, and I said I don't. And he said, well, this whole business about God the Father probably would work real well for you. Now why don't you give him some power in your life? And I said, because I don't know what he wants. And he and I used to go fishing on Lake Winnebago, and we'd sit out there and have conversations about God. And he said, well, he would do weird stuff. He was a really nice guy. His name is Father Olson. Will was his first name. And we were sitting out on Lake Winnebago, which is 471 square miles. It's a very large lake. And it's shallow, which means don't ever go on it when it's wavy. So we were sitting out in the middle of the lake catching white bass. And here comes this big black cloud along. This is I swear to it, this is no exaggeration. Here comes a big black cloud. That's bad news. So I said, Father Olson, that doesn't look good. And he said, it's all right, Bob. And I said, no, it's not. Keep an eye on that. And he said, oh, Bob. So help me God, and the cloud went off to the north. And I'm going, this guy's hooked up. Something I don't understand. And when the book talks about the second step, it talks about if you're even willing to believe. And I was. Didn't know what to believe. I was just willing to believe. And it says, if you're even willing to believe, upon the simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. That's all you need. It's just a willingness. That's why mustard seed is the name of a lot of groups in Alcoholics Anonymous. You need some small grain of willingness to make this thing work for you. And it was interesting because if you were listening to Dan, he talked about the bedevilments. Can't seem to be of real help to other people. We're prey to misery and depression, a sense of uselessness, all of those things. And then it talks about people who have power, peace, happiness, and a sense of direction. That's everything I ever wanted in life. Power, peace, happiness, sense of direction. What do we leave out? And it says that the difference between those two types of people, the people who have these bedevilments where life seems to be a chore, make heavy going out of life basically, and the people that have power, peace, happiness, and a sense of direction, is that these people who have all these positive things have God as the central fact in their life. You know, today, even at 34 years sober, when my life starts to go south, I know what's going on. Yeah, I don't have God as the central fact in my life anymore. What's the central fact in my life is that I've started to worship other things. Now, take a look at this. If your life starts to go south, look at the big three. Money, sex, and power. And if you're worshiping one of those three things, you're going to think you walked into an avalanche. Okay? That's what happens. And then what I need to do is I need to move back into this position where God once again becomes the central fact in my life. The book talks about being crushed by a self-imposed crisis. It said we can't postpone it or evade it. It isn't alcoholism. It's the fact that I can't fix myself. And see, I have a degenerative and fatal disease, and if you think you got some, like, alcoholism light, boy, are you blowing smoke up your backside. If you have alcoholism, you're every bit as serious as I am. And you can't postpone it, you can't evade it. And it says we had to fearlessly face the proposition that God is everything or he's nothing, either is or he isn't. And then it says, what's your choice to be? Asks you to make a choice. What is it? And it says here we are squarely confronted with the issue of faith. The reason why we're squarely confronted with the issue of faith at that point is because we can't fix ourselves, and we can't fix you either. Okay? The power in Alcoholics Anonymous comes from God. We can influence other people, but the power comes from God. And the whole idea that we have become powerful will just make us spin out and burn up. I have an enormous amount of power, and none of it's mine. And so do you. About the time I had moved to Denver, and about the time I got back involved, I heard a guy speak at Sunday Night Young People's in Denver, and he was talking about the book being a textbook, in that there was a clear set of instructions in there, and that to show others precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of the book. So I thought, whoa, and I knew I was going to drink again. When I was a year sober, never worked a step. No, I was just hoping for the best. But I knew it was going to catch up with me at some point. And if you have that feeling, go find somebody that knows how to do these things and get your backside into it now. People, it just drives me nuts. I'll tell you about reason. I'll have to write about this. People come into Alcoholics Anonymous and they're told, just hang around, get both feet on the ground, rest up, go to some meetings, find a sponsor, and when you feel better, we'll get you involved. Now, what's the most compelling statement in the whole big book? With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough. Where? What the hell does that mean? Does that mean next week? That means right now. And if you've got someone dying from alcoholism and you think they're too messed up to do the steps, you're wrong. Let me share something with you about intuition. The book talks about intuition as a working part of the mind, as becoming a working part of the mind, that initially we may do some strange things with it. But we learn to trust it, and it becomes a working part of our mind. Everyone who comes into Alcoholics Anonymous has intuition. I don't care how messed up they are, how drunk they've been, I don't care. When they walk through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, their intuition is working full time. And then they have to make some choices. And unfortunately, likes attract in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that means that step workers hang out with step workers and bullshitters hang out with bullshitters. So maybe you ought to take a look at who you're hanging out with. See, if you come into Alcoholics Anonymous and you want to slide, you go find a slider. That's what you'll do. People's intuitions are working 100% when they walk through the door. And so it's important. They can pick out a person with a recovery with nothing more than their intuition. They'll walk in and they will spot somebody and they will say, there's a person with a solution. And that's why it's so important for you to have the solution. You don't have to go out looking for pigeons, for sponsees. Well, we call them pigeons. I don't know. They will inundate you if you are clear. Okay? So, 1975 International came along. Lois Wilson was there. It was just wonderful. I mean, we were all in tears when the flags came out and all the rest of the stuff from all the countries that had AA. And then this guy comes out and talks from Winnipeg. His name was Mac Cheater. And he talked about the Golden Slipper Group in Winnipeg. And they were called the Golden Slippers because they couldn't stay sober. And they decided they were going to take a whole new approach toward Alcoholics Anonymous because they were losing all their members. And then the approach was that they weren't going to intellectualize about the steps or rationalize about the steps or do any of that stuff about the steps. They were going to just get rid of that. They were going to take a whole new approach towards Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was that they were going to do the steps. Now, some of you may not know this, but steps aren't just to agree with, right? You know, but somebody will look up there and say, came to believe in a power greater than ourselves, and they go, yeah. So they sat down and started at the forward to the first edition, and they did everything that was in the book, and they did it as a group, and they stayed sober. And in 1975, 15 of us, after that convention, sat down in a guy's basement. This guy's name was Jay Levy, who is now passed on. We sat down in his basement, and we started at the beginning of the book, and all the way through the whole first section, right up until the stories. Every time it said pray, we prayed. Every time it said write, we wrote. Every time it said made a decision, we made a decision. And out of the 15 of us, now remember that's 1975, which is what, 32 years ago. Yeah. 14 of us stayed sober. All right? The other one was a guy named Eddie Durkin, and he froze to death in a doorway on Larimer Street. But Don Pritz was in that group, Gary Brown was in that group, one of the guys that came down here before named Mike Shane was in that group. There were, this stuff works. It really works. But I got to tell you that sobriety is so much more than not drinking. Not drinking is not enough. You know, not drinking, but being as crazy as the day you came through the door is awful. That's a terrible way to live. And unfortunately, I have never seen, to the best of my knowledge, anyone come into Alcoholics Anonymous that didn't have a head full of nonsense. We all took a third step together on our knees, all 15 of us. Said the prayer, meant it. Okay? And then my sponsor told me I had to write inventory. And so I did. And he told me I had to write a grudge list of all the people. The book says that we inventory people, institutions, and principles. So I wrote down all the people that I had a grudge against, which is almost everybody I ever met. I mean, it was a very long list. And then you write down why you're mad at them, what it affected, your self-esteem, your security, your ambitions, your personal or sex relations. And then you go back in the fourth column and see where you were selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened. You can also write institutions. What are institutions? Schools, police, courts. There's a lot of different kinds of institutions that you can write about. Now I want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 28 years sober. I was talking to God. I don't ever expect an answer, but I was talking to God in my 11th step and said, I've been sober for 28 years. I've been writing inventory every year. And why do I still believe this kind of insanity that if people really knew me, they wouldn't like me? Why do I believe that I'm not good enough? Why do I believe that my only value to women is my ability to make lots of money? Why do I believe that I'm a fraud? Why do I believe that I have to hold up some sort of facade so people will like me? And I was mad. And I heard something. And the answer was principles. And see, now I'm having a conversation with myself. And I'm thinking, now you really went over the edge. I've heard things twice in my life, heard voices, and this was once. The other time I was flying back from Tampa, and I heard, you're done. And I knew that I had to stop going out and doing this and speaking at conventions for a period of time because I needed to try and put my marriage back together, and I needed to coach my kids in Little League soccer. And I did that, and we won the soccer championship, and my divorce, man, I got divorced. But it was just fine. And I said, no, principles are things like honesty, open-mindedness, willingness. That's a principle. And the answer that I got was, no, it's not. The dictionary definition of principles is fundamental truth. And this is a fundamental truth about you, and you got a head full of self-defeating ideas, self-defeating beliefs about who and what you are. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do about it? And they said, put the belief in the first column. And so I wrote down, if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me, in the first column. And in the second column, I opened the book, and I looked at the top of the second column, and it says the cause. Now, what caused me to believe that? What caused me to believe that was when I was a kid, that people were telling me, well, you're going to die in a gutter just like your old man, or you're going to wind up in a mental institution like your mother. Now, if you're 12 years old and you're told you're worthless, that has an effect on you. And I can tell you that we have all had seeds planted in our heads by people who were either angry at us or were a smart ass about something. And it becomes gospel. And so, someone with no good intention may have come up to us and said, you're stupid, you're clumsy, you're ugly, you're fat. And that stuff just gets embedded in our personalities. So that was the cause. And then I looked and I thought, well, I'll play the game. I'm having some sort of emotional breakdown here. I'll read the rest of it. And so I asked the next questions. Does that affect your self-esteem? It destroys it. If I think that that every time I form a friendship with someone, at some point they are going to abandon me or just tell me to go away, why would I do that? That really affects my self-esteem. It affects my security. I can't be secure in a relationship with anybody. I can't be secure in a job. I can't be secure in anything if I believe that. Does it affect my ambitions? Absolutely. My ambition is to become successful in business, to become successful financially, to become successful in relationships. to have the love of my children. None of that stuff is going to happen if that's the truth. Does it affect your personal relations? Yeah. Does it affect your sex relations? Yeah, sex relations are just personal relations on steroids. So, I wrote down about 15 things that I believed about myself that were self-defeating, that I had so deeply embedded in my personality that they became sacrosanct. I wouldn't even challenge them anymore. And you see, I can't become the person that God intended me to be if I walk around believing that nonsense. It just isn't going to happen. If I am going to reach the potential that God intended for me, I got to get all that junk out of my head. And I can tell you that in the last 7 years of writing that kind of inventory and teaching people how to write that kind of inventory, that it has made a marked difference, sometimes spectacular difference, in what's going on in their lives. And I know that it's, when the Department of Corrections came up to me and said, Bob, we'd like you to start providing psychiatric care, I was dumbfounded. I went, well, I said I didn't want to tell them, well, I've seen a lot of psychiatrists. I know, say they started me on phenobarbital when I was 14. And they said, we would like you to start providing us with psychiatric care. And I know enough after all this time to go, And so I said, well, let me look into that. And I went out and I found out that because psychiatrists are all involved in managed care these days, and I can pay them in 6 weeks instead of 6 months, and I can pay them more per patient, that they will line up to do business with me. How the hell did that happen? We are people who constantly underestimate our ability to live life successfully. And the big book says we can. We will learn to live life successfully. Why don't we believe that? The reason we don't believe that is because we got all that nonsense in our head. And none of it's true. It's all lies. It's all lies. If you think you're substandard goods, or you think that in some way you are diminished compared to other people, you are wrong. If I don't do anything else down here, I want you to challenge yourself. One of the best things that my sponsor ever did to me was ask me over and over and over again, how the hell would you know? You think you know who you are? I don't think so. Would you like to find out? Are you willing? Do you have the courage to go look? There is recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous through the steps. I fifth-stepped it with my sponsor. I went out and made amends. Amends for me were really difficult. I had huge financial amends. And about the time I got done with them, I had a business that I had to shut down, and all of a sudden I was $250,000 in debt after I paid my amends the first time. 90 days later, it was paid. And I went to my sponsor and I said, how do you explain that? And he said, doesn't require explanation. And I said, come on, this is some kind of Zen trick. And he said, no, it doesn't require. And I said, Don, I paid off $250,000 in 90 days. How'd that happen? And he said, God's got all the money he needs. If you despair because of a situation in your life, it'll change. The nature of life is that everything changes all the time. We're like moving objects on a moving plane, and we spend our whole lives trying to hold everything down so it doesn't go away. See, and you'll have to excuse my language, but it's a thing called, it's a syndrome called, it may be a pile of shit, but at least it's my pile of shit. Why don't you abandon it? If that's what you're living in, walk away from it. You got choices. And if you don't know what your choices are, go through this process. There is true recovery here. There is true understanding here. There is a way to find the truth here, if you're willing to look, if you have the courage. You know, when the book talks about fear inventory, it says something odd. It says men of faith have courage. And, you know, I looked at that and went, if you got faith, what do you need courage for? Huh? It's because my faith isn't perfect. And then I need courage. And so I go, okay, God, give me some courage. And I think it's enough courage to get on a great white horse and attack multitudes, right? You know what kind of courage I get? Just enough to get one foot in front of the other. Do you know that living a spiritual life for me sometimes is taking every bit of courage I can get? Sometimes somebody's going to come up and ask you some questions. And the questions will go like this. What do you stand for? You know what I was told? I said, let me think about that. And he said, if you don't know, you don't stand for anything. I don't like that. And so I had to look at what I stand for. What principles do you live by? Do you have the courage of your convictions? Go to an AA meeting. Watch somebody that is so full of BS that you just can't hardly stand it. Okay? What are you going to do? You're just going to keep quiet and wander out? What if you need to tell someone that they're dying from alcoholism and you don't want to do it because you know everybody in the room's going to think you're a jerk? Will you do it? Huh? Most people won't. Most people are so afraid to not be liked in Alcoholics Anonymous that they won't do the most kind thing they can do for someone in trouble, and that is acquaint them with the truth. All right? Do you have the courage to do that in the light of other people not liking you? I hope you do. People are so concerned about looking bad. Okay? Do you want to know the truth about that? Nobody's looking. Everybody's so wrapped up in their own stuff that they aren't even looking at what you're doing. You go, oh, hey, Olson really gave somebody some shit in a meeting today. Okay. You're either living a spiritual life or you're not. All right? Let me look at this. I had to make amends to my dad. My dad was a chronic alcoholic and a violent one. And I would rather have been shot than to make amends to my dad. My dad had a stroke, and he lost his ability to speak, and he lost his motor skills on half of his body. And when I went to I read my inventory to my sponsor. He said, you need to make amends to your dad. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, yeah, you do. And I said, for what? He's the guy that created all the problems. He said, you held him at arm's length your whole life because you didn't understand you were an alcoholic. Or you didn't understand that he was an alcoholic. You just thought he was a drunk and a bad guy. And I said, yeah, well, he's alcoholic. And he said, so are you. And I said, so what are you asking me to do? And he said, I want you to drive to the Grand Army home in Wisconsin and tell him that you regret having done that. I didn't want to do that. And he said, I don't give a damn. That's what you're going to do. So I went to the Grand Army home in King, Wisconsin, drove out there from Colorado, and walked in there and said, I'm looking for a guy named Bob Olson. Oh, Jesus, they used to call me Junior. And they said, that's him over there in the wheelchair. And I went over there, and they told me that he was incapable of any kind of continuous thought, that the stroke had damaged him that badly. And so I walked over to him, and he looked up at me, and I said, hi, I'm your son, Bob. And I think at some level that he recognized that. And I said, I want to talk to you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to just wheel you into this other room. And when we got in there, I said, I'm an alcoholic. And he got visibly sad. And I said, but I'm part of a fellowship, Alcoholics Anonymous, and part of that fellowship is for us to make right the wrongs that we've been involved in. And I harmed you. And the way I harmed you was by holding you away from me. He used to call me every year on my birthday, really drunk. And I would always hang up on him. And he could find me. And my sponsor said, you know how tough that is for a drunk? Do you know how hard he had to try to find you? So I told him I regretted having done that. But that I didn't drink anymore, and part of that process was to try and make that right with him. And when I told him I didn't drink anymore, he got really excited. And I told him that whatever I could do to make that right, I would do. He died not too long after that. And I encourage you, if you owe any amends, get out there and get them done. My dad died like a drunk dies. He had adult onset diabetes, and this was 20 years ago. And they called my Uncle Leif, and his brother, and said, we're going to have to amputate one of his feet because he's getting gangrene in his foot from the diabetes. And they didn't have diabetes management like they do today. And so they cut his foot off, and then they called back my uncle, and they said, we're going to have to take his other foot off and one of his hands. And so he okayed that, and then they called him back again and said, well, look, he keeps getting worse, and he keeps getting gangrene in his extremities. And there are really two choices here. We can keep taking pieces off of him, or we can just let him die. And my uncle said maybe the kindest thing is just to let him die. So they did, and he knew that at some level. The four horsemen of alcoholism are terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. And despair is the worst. And he understood that. And when people came anywhere near him, he would scream. And that's the way he died. I don't have to. You don't have to. Are you willing to do anything about your own condition? Are you willing to look? Are you willing to live by principles? Are you willing to seek the truth? Thanks.